Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we are peeling back the velvet curtain to explore a life that was all-consuming, intensely hierarchical, and utterly dependent on the whims of a monarch. What was life like for a servant at a royal palace? The air is thick and chill. It's a darkness that even the weak, sputtering rushlight in your hand can barely pierce. You shiver, but not just from the cold. It's the deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes from living a life dictated by clocks you barely own, and responsibilities that dwarf your own existence. You are currently standing at the bottom of the long winding staircase, its stone steps worn into shallow crescents by centuries of hurried feet just like yours. A clock somewhere high up in the palace's inner tower chimes 4 times, a deep resonant bong that seems to shake the very foundations of the building and, honestly, the last 2 hours of your remaining precious sleep. 4 o'clock. That is the time the day begins for you, the lowest rung on the staff ladder. While the king, or queen, is still nestled beneath the layers of goose down and heavy damask, dreaming of conquests or treaties, you're already tramping through the service tunnels, a subterranean maze of cold stone and creeping damp. Your mission: to ensure the royal apartments are warm, scented, and utterly perfect before the first rays of the sun dare to touch the gilded window panes. You probably won't survive this pace. It's a marathon run at a sprint, and any misstep means swift, brutal consequences from your immediate superiors. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up this late or this early, let me know where you are and what time it is for you right now, down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You clutch the rushlight, a simple reed dipped in animal fat, and your nostrils are immediately assaulted by the smells of the palace at rest. Stale cooking grease wafting from the kitchens, the sharp tang of mice urine in the dark corners, and faintly, the sickeningly sweet smell of the rose potpourri that tries and fails to mask everything else. You're on your way to the royal fires. This isn't just about tossing a log on the grate, it's a precise ceremonial duty. You must build the king's morning fire with only the finest, driest oak, ensuring it burns silently and without producing any smoke that could dare to offend the monarch's delicate morning air. You reach the vast, echoing hearths located in the service annexes. It's here you meet others who share your subterranean schedule, the junior kitchen hands, the lamplighters, and the chamber grooms who are already gathering buckets of steaming water. You exchange silent nods. There's a camaraderie born of shared misery, but very little time for conversation. You grab your bucket of pre-cut, meticulously stacked kindling. The rule is simple. The king must never see the fire being built, only the finished, perfect glow. You ascend again, using the hidden spiral staircases meant only for staff. When you finally reach the main corridor outside the king's private chamber, you hold your breath. The grand double doors, carved and painted with mythological scenes, seem to watch you. You use your small, specific master key to enter the antechamber. This room is still dark, draped in a heavy, rich gloom that smells of old velvet and lavender. You move like a ghost. This is the mainstream historical fact of palace service. Many servants, especially those in the personal service of the monarch, were required to perform their duties in complete silence and near darkness during the pre-dawn hours to maintain the illusion that the king or queen simply woke up to a perfect environment, rather than witnessing the messy labour required to create it. It was about preserving the myth of effortless royalty. You find the king's bedroom fireplace. It's huge, swallowing the light from your rush. You carefully place the kindling, the dry oak logs, and a single, perfectly cut piece of charcoal. You don't strike a spark, not yet. You use a small shovel to gently remove the cold ash from yesterday, transferring it into a leather bucket. Then, you retreat to a tiny, windowless closet, your post, to wait for the arrival of the groom of the stool. Ah, the groom of the stool. Now, there's a job title that raises a modern eyebrow. This is where things get a little quirky or fringe tidbit. For centuries in the English and Scottish courts, this was one of the highest honours a nobleman could hold, a position of massive influence, power and intimacy with the king. And why was he called the groom of the stool? Because his original primary duty was to supervise the king's bodily functions, specifically assisting him with his bowel movements, managing the king's chair or stool, which was a portable commode. The The prestige came from the fact that this person literally had the king's ear during his most private moments, making him a critical advisor. You, however, are just the lowly fire starter, the background hum to this royal opera. You wait, stiff and cold, for the whisper of silk approaching. When the groom arrives, trailed by a few other high-ranking valets, the chamber springs into hushed, choreographed motion. The groom will finally grant the signal. You dart out, strike your flint, and light the carefully laid fire. It catches instantly, just as it must. The first flicker of orange light dances over the gilded furniture and the sleeping figure in the enormous four-poster bed. Your next task is the king's chamber pot. You gather the ceramic vessel, which has sat under the bed since last night. It's a heavy, unpleasant weight in your hands. You must carry it down through those hidden staircases, past the kitchens, all the way to the necessary house or the privy drain without spilling a single drop. The path is long, dark and uneven. This is a common duty for junior staff, and it is a terrifying thought. If you slip, if you spill the king's waste on the pristine marble floor, you're finished. A few days in the stocks, a month's pay docked, or simply dismissal, which means starvation on the streets. You make it safely and return, slightly breathless, to the main floor. The palace is now beginning to stir. More staff are emerging, their faces tired but alert. It's approaching 6 o'clock. Now begins the elaborate water ceremony. You join the others carrying vast copper buckets of hot, steaming water, heated in the kitchen annexes, not yet with the benefit of modern plumbing, up to the royal bathing chamber. Historians still argue whether the high, medieval and early modern royal courts bathed frequently or rarely. Records are often contradictory, and cleanliness standards varied wildly by monarch and era. While some monarchs, like Queen Elizabeth I, were recorded as bathing relatively often, perhaps once a month, many others considered full immersion baths dangerous or unhealthy, preferring instead to simply rub down with linen cloth soaked in alcohol or scented water. Regardless, the royal apartments must be supplied with gallons of steaming water every single morning for washing hands, faces, shaving, and rinsing fine linens. The physical exertion is immense. You trudge, bucket after bucket, your shoulders aching. This is before breakfast, before your actual day job begins. You wipe the sweat from your brow with the back of a hand that is already perpetually grubby, despite the palace's impossible standards. The final touches for this morning service involve scent. You bring up a bowl of finely ground spices and aromatic woods to be placed near the fire, ensuring a pleasant perfume fills the air as the monarch wakes. You also gather yesterday's crumpled clothes, tossing them into the designated linen bin, careful not to even look too closely at the fine silks, velvets, and embroidery that are worth more than you will earn in a lifetime. By the time the sun is actually up, throwing long dusty shafts of light through the east-facing windows, the light that reveals just how much cleaning is still required, you're already halfway through a labourer's shift. You have built the fire, emptied the pot, carried the water, and scented the air. You've been awake for 3 hours, and the king is only just now beginning to rub the sleep from his eyes and call for his first official audience. Your immediate task is done, but your day is far from over. In fact, it's just about to get infinitely more stressful, because now you must eat, and then report for duty in the largest, hottest, and most volatile room in the palace, the kitchens. You turn and disappear down a narrow, shadowy passage, your stomach growling with a hunger that won't be satisfied by the meagre serving of bread and watery beer that awaits. The palace is awake, and you have for now survived the first ritual. You have swallowed your meagre breakfast, a chunk of dense, stale bread and a cup of small beer, the safer option compared to the often questionable palace water, and you now report for the next shift. The air you breathed in the royal apartments was cool and carefully scented. The air you breathe now is a humid, suffocating curtain of heat, smoke, and the aggressive smell of fat and burning wood. You're descending into the great kitchens, a vast, smoky, subterranean world that is the true beating heart of the palace. If the royal chambers are the brain, the kitchens are the gut, messy, loud, demanding, and constantly processing vast amounts of material. The noise is immediate and overwhelming. The clash of copper pots, the rhythmic pounding of a meat cleaver against a wooden block, the hiss of fat spitting into a roaring fire pit, and the constant, furious shouting of orders from above. Your position as a junior scullery hand is about as low as you can get without being a turnspit boy. A truly miserable job we'll get to later. You're one of perhaps 50 or 60 staff members crammed into this cavernous space, each with a rigid, non-negotiable role. You immediately get your assigned task, the copper scullery. This is the mainstream historical fact of the royal kitchen. The scale was gargantuan. A typical medieval or Renaissance royal household might feed anywhere from 500 to 1,000 people daily, from the king and his inner circle down to the lowliest guards and stable boys. This required a monumental operation. Imagine a modern professional football team's catering operation, but without electricity, running water, refrigeration or decent ventilation. That's what you're dealing with, and all of it had to be prepared on open hearths in spits, leading to incredible physical danger and exhaustion. Your job is the pots, specifically the hundreds of expensive, heavy copper cooking vessels that are currently caked in blackened grease and burnt on food from the night's last round of cooking. You trudge over to the cleaning station, which is basically a large stone sink area perpetually flowing with lukewarm, greasy water. The cleaning implements are primitive: coarse sand, wood ash, a natural abrasive, and heavy, stiff-bristled brushes. You grab a pot, a cauldron that could easily hold you, and it is still radiating residual heat, burning your already blistered hands. The chef de cuisine, the master cook, is the tyrannical god of this realm. He strides through the chaos in his oil-stained whites, a copper spoon often raised to deliver a stinging reprimand, or sometimes a stunning blow. He controls the entire hierarchy, from the sauce master and the roast master down to the larder grooms and you. Everyone is terrified of him, and rightly so. If a dish is spoiled, or if a pot is not perfectly clean, thus risking the flavour of the next meal, the blame, and the punishment, lands immediately and heavily on the nearest staff member. You are scrubbing fiercely, your arms aching with the effort of lifting and rotating the heavy copper. The noise is now just a relentless drone. Suddenly a small pale boy, covered head to toe in soot and sweat, rushes past you, narrowly avoiding a collision. This is the turnspit boy. Now this is a truly quirky or fringe tidbit that often gets overlooked. Before automated mechanisms or even reliable dog-powered turnspits, it was a junior servant's job to literally sit or stand next to the roaring fire and turn the heavy metal spit for hours on end, ensuring the roast was cooked evenly. The heat was unbearable, the smoke was blinding, and the work was monotonous to the point of delirium. It was a job so vile that even your cleaning duty looks appealing by comparison. You see the boy's red, watering eyes and silently pity him. The stress is amplified by the sheer quantity of the ingredients. You see enormous sides of beef being butchered. You're talking animals larger than your kitchen at home. Piles of exotic spices that arrive sealed in wax from distant lands, and baskets overflowing with vegetables that must be washed, peeled and prepped. Every single task is done by hand. There are no machines to assist, only muscle, heat and speed. You're constantly battling the elements and the clock. The king requires his midday dinner, the largest meal of the day, to be served in precisely 4 hours. That means the entire process, from slaughter, which usually happened the day before but sometimes not, to plating, has to be executed flawlessly. There are dozens of dishes to prepare, often served à la française, meaning everything is placed on the table at once in one glorious, overwhelming display of royal wealth. This is why the plating, the final frantic rush, is so crucial. A scullery foreman yells your name. He's holding a small copper pan you just cleaned. He points a greasy finger at a tiny fleck of carbon residue on the rim. "Is this fit for the king's stew, idiot?" he snarls, his voice cutting through the din. You snatch the pan back, your face burning, and scrub the spot again with fresh sand until the copper gleams like gold. It's this meticulous, almost neurotic standard of cleanliness, often at odds with the overall hygiene of the palace, that keeps you constantly on edge. A small oversight is not just a mistake. It's a potential poison source, or worse, an insult to the monarch's palate. You catch a glimpse of the ewerer, a higher-ranking servant whose job it is to ensure the king and queen have clean water for washing their hands at the table, a highly symbolic gesture. He's supervising the polishing of silver tableware, which is done with chalk and vast amounts of elbow grease. Unlike the copper pots, which will be buried in the greasy shadows of the kitchen, the silver must shine for all the court to see. The contrast between his relative cleanliness and your grimy reality is stark. As you pause for a half-second to stretch your burning shoulders, you witness one of the palace's inevitable daily incidents. A junior cook, distracted by the heat, trips over a basket of turnips and sends a huge steaming bowl of strained broth. destined for the master cook's tasting spoon, splashing across the stone floor. The master cook's roar is deafening. The broth spiller immediately falls to his knees, not to clean the mess, but to beg for mercy. The punishment is swift, a furious tongue-lashing and the docking of 3 days' wages. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen you heard about in the past? It was probably a safer gamble than working under the constant explosive volatility of this kitchen. This is why historians still argue whether the constant documented theft and perquisites, the polite term for pilfering, that plagued royal kitchens was due to simple greed, or in large part due to the incredibly meagre wages and constant risk of arbitrary financial punishment faced by the lower staff. If you lost 3 days' pay for spilling soup, and your actual salary barely covered a tiny room in the city, what choice did you have but to sneak a piece of bread or a scrap of meat out the back door? The system almost required minor corruption to survive. Finally, your station is cleared. The pots are stacked, gleaming faintly in the dim light, awaiting inspection. Your hands are raw, smelling strongly of grease, soap, and copper polish. You have survived the scullery, but now you are immediately redirected. The chief laundry warden has sent an urgent message. The royal party has accidentally spoiled an entire trunkload of delicate linens and gowns and requires them cleaned tonight for a last-minute travelling engagement. You're dismissed from the heat of the fire only to be plunged into the cold, soapy dampness of the washhouse. You wipe the soot from your face, take a deep breath of the comparatively cleaner air of the service corridor, and reluctantly turn towards the next monumental task. The kitchen chaos is over, but the war against the filth of royalty is just beginning. You trudge on, knowing that no matter how hard you work, no matter how clean you get that copper pot, the stains of palace life will never leave you. You emerge from the suffocating heat of the kitchens, only to be met by the clammy, heavy atmosphere of the royal washhouse. It is a world of perpetual dampness, where the smell of soap and lye, a corrosive chemical derived from wood ash, mixes with the stench of unwashed bodies and sour laundry. Your brief respite from the smoke is replaced by the pervasive chill that seems to cling to your bones no matter how hard you work. The washhouse is usually located far from the main palace. For good reason, it's loud, messy, and the vast, steaming coppers, the large metal pots, where laundry is boiled, pose a constant fire risk. Here, you report to the laundry warden, a severe woman with hands permanently wrinkled from years in the water, who runs her domain with the precision of a drill sergeant. She does not tolerate sloppiness, or, worse, shrinkage. Your eyes immediately land on the mountains of laundry. It's not just the sheer quantity that is staggering, but the quality. You are faced with chests overflowing with the finest linen chemises, heavy silk damask bed hangings, tapestries, delicate lace collars, and the elaborately embroidered court garments of the king and queen. These clothes are often stiffened with whalebone, padded, weighted with precious stones, and layered with fragile ornamentation. They are works of art, and you are tasked with cleaning them without destroying them. This brings us to the mainstream historical fact of pre-industrial laundry. It was brutally difficult, highly damaging to fabrics, and required specialized knowledge. Washing required the transport of hundreds of gallons of water, often from a distant well or river, heating it in those huge copper cauldrons over open fires, and then using highly alkaline caustic soaps, made from animal fat and lye, to break down the grease and dirt. The physical toll on the servant was immense, involving hours of back-breaking scrubbing, lifting heavy, waterlogged textiles, and stirring boiling clothes with large paddles. Your specific duty is the pre-soak and the initial beating. You haul a massive load of royal undergarments, chemises, shifts, and hose into a great stone trough. Even the intimate garments of the king and queen are opulent, made of the finest linen, but their filth is universal. You pound the laundry with a heavy wooden bat, rhythmically thwacking the sodden fabric against the stone to loosen the soil. The noise is like a distant, chaotic drumming, merging with the sighs and grunts of the other washerwomen and men around you. The water turns instantly murky. You try not to think about what exactly you are removing from the fabric. As you beat the king's favourite sleeping shirt, you recall a quirky or fringe tidbit about royal fashion and hygiene. Many wealthy or royal persons didn't often wash their outer garments, such as velvets and silks, because the harsh washing process would ruin them. Instead, they relied on thick linen undergarments, which were changed daily and absorbed all the sweat, oils, and dirt. Therefore, the laundry you're currently attacking, the underwear, was arguably the most disgustingly soiled, but also the most essential part of the royal wardrobe in terms of hygiene. No wonder you're soaked in a permanent film of grease and grime. Suddenly, the laundry warden holds up a lady-in-waiting's silk handkerchief, embroidered with tiny pearls. It has a visible stain, likely a spill of wine or perhaps chocolate, which was highly prized and therefore notoriously difficult to remove. "This is a job for the fine soap station," she barks, sending you off to a specialised section. Fine fabrics couldn't withstand the harsh lye and boiling water. You must now use a gentler, more expensive and more unusual cleaning agent. You grab a paste made of specialised clay, mixed with rainwater, and a strange substance. Stale urine. Yes, human urine, known at the time as chamber lye, was sometimes collected and used because the ammonia in it acts as a mild bleach and cleaning agent. It's truly disgusting, but you apply the ammonia-rich slurry carefully to the delicate silk, rubbing it gently with a small piece of fine wool. This is one of those times you remember just how far modern comfort is from your gritty reality. You'd trade your life savings for a bottle of modern laundry detergent. The biggest terror in the wash house, however, isn't the smell or the backache. It's the loss of a royal item. Everything is catalogued, counted and signed for by the laundry warden. If a pearl is lost from an embroidered cuff, if a lace trim is torn, or if a single stocking goes missing, you, the person responsible for that item, are held financially and sometimes physically responsible. The cost of a simple silk scarf could easily be 3 months of your wages. This pressure is relentless. You move to the drying process. After the washing and a tedious process of rinsing in progressively cleaner water, the linens must be carefully hung. The heavy bed sheets require several people just to carry them outside to be stretched across long sun-exposed lines. If it rains, you have to rush out and gather everything quickly, or the work is wasted. You struggle to lift a particularly thick royal blanket, the effort causing a sharp spasm in your lower back. The next stage is the meticulous pressing and folding. Fine fabrics must be smoothed and prepared, laces and ruffs, those incredibly elaborate, stiffly starched collars worn by courtiers, require a special, heavy and very hot iron, often just a solid piece of metal heated on the hearth and managed with thick gloves. If the iron is too cold, the ruff is limp, too hot, and the irreplaceable fabric burns. This job demands intense focus. As you spend an hour carefully folding a stack of the Queen's freshly scented linens, you overhear 2 older servants gossiping about palace expenditure. This leads to the observation that historians still argue whether the high cost of maintaining a royal wardrobe and laundry operation was a greater drain on the national treasury than the actual food bill, given the thousands of yards of expensive foreign silks, velvets, and imported laces that had to be maintained or replaced annually, and the wages for the hundreds of people like you in the laundry and tailoring departments. The cost of keeping the royal family looking impeccable was truly astronomical. You finish your shift in the wash house feeling cleaner from the waist down but utterly spent. Your hands are raw, red, and swollen from the constant immersion in lye water, and the smell of soap and wet wool will follow you for hours. You've successfully managed to clean the royal underwear, and not a single pearl has gone missing. A small victory, but a necessary one. The laundry warden nods curtly, a rare gesture of approval. But before you can even think about the possibility of a brief rest, a messenger arrives from the steward's office. Your duty roster has been urgently updated. Your attention to detail in the scullery and the washhouse has been noted, and you are being assigned a new, much more public and far more terrifying role. Moving above stairs to serve in the public spaces. You are moving up, but closer to the fire. You must learn the complex, unspoken rules of rank and address among the staff. Because in the public eye, a simple misstep in protocol is worse than a stained shirt. You leave the damp comfort of the washhouse and head towards the intimidating glow of the main halls, where the palace's strict social structure dictates your every move. The relative freedom of the washhouse, where the rigid hierarchy was softened by the shared physical labour, vanishes the moment you ascend into the main palace body. You leave the back corridors and enter the world of above stairs, and the change is immediate, visceral and terrifying. The air is warmer, perfumed with beeswax and expensive incense, and the silence is punctuated only by the soft tap-tap of polished boots on marble. You're no longer judged solely by your scrubbing power, but by your knowledge of the court's complex, utterly rigid social map. You now realise that the palace is not just a building, It is a meticulously ordered human ecosystem, defined by rank and proximity to the monarch. The phrase, above stairs, below stairs, is far more than a spatial description. It is a classification system that dictates your salary, your uniform, who you speak to, where you eat, and even the quality of your meagre bed. This is the mainstream historical fact of the royal household. The structure was a mirror of the kingdom's aristocracy, a sprawling bureaucracy designed to manage every facet of the king's life, from his treasury to his towel. In the early modern English court, for example, the household was often divided into the chamber, staff dealing directly with the king's person, and private apartments, and the below-stairs departments, like the kitchen, scullery and laundry. Your recent promotion, or rather reassignment, means you're now serving in the corridors of the chamber, placing you under the direct watchful eye of the highest-ranking nobles who hold ceremonial court offices. Your current status is likely that of a junior chamber hand or a page of the back stairs. You're just one rank up from the deepest depths of the scullery, but that small step is a monumental leap in prestige and, more importantly, opportunity. The kitchen hands lived a life of brute force and anonymity. You now live a life of discretion and display. Your clothes are cleaner, perhaps a hand-me-down livery of drab wool, but they are still livery, a uniform that announces your position immediately. You learn the hierarchy of your fellow staff through bitter experience. At the top of the servant chain are the high officials, such as the Lord Chamberlain and the Master of the Horse, who are nobles whose roles are mostly administrative and deeply political. They barely acknowledge your existence gliding past in silks and furs. Below them are the grooms and gentlemen of the bedchamber, often minor gentry, whose duties are intimate and ceremonial, like the terrifying groom of the stool we mentioned earlier. They have access to the king and command respect from the junior staff. Then come the middle ranks, the yeoman officers, who manage stores and supervise large departments like the larder or the silver scullery. They have the power to make your life easy or miserable, and you must treat them with deference that borders on fear. Finally, there are the lowest ranks, the pages, the junior hands, the scullions and the porters, and this is where you reside. You discover the cruel reality of the pecking order. The page of the chamber, just one rank above you, sees it as his right to command you to run an errand that is clearly not yours, simply because he can. You learn quickly that your day is now spent not just completing tasks, but managing expectations and protecting your tiny piece of status. If the scullion from the kitchen tries to tell you to empty their bin, you can refuse, asserting your new higher rank. But if a groom of the chamber tells you to do it, you leap to obey, because defying him is defying a shadow of the king. It is a subtle, constant game of psychological warfare. As you stand near a grand entrance, waiting for an order, you watch a procession of higher-ranking officials. One of them, a yeoman of the ewer, is carrying a silver basin. This involves a truly quirky or fringe tidbit about the lengths to which servants would go to establish their status. A yeoman of the ewer, tasked with providing the king with water for washing his hands before meals, often carried his basin with an exaggerated posture and a deep solemnity. This wasn't just to honour the king, it was to subtly signal to every lower-ranking servant that he was a man of importance, entrusted with a vital, ceremonial role and therefore untouchable by the likes of you. Every rigid step was a display of status. The most stressful element of this new environment is the need for complete discretion. You are now within earshot of conversations that could ruin ministers, launch wars, or change the fate of the nation. You are an invisible backdrop to high-stakes political intrigue. You must master the skill of hearing everything and seeing nothing. You polish the same brass fixture for 10 minutes, your gaze fixed on the reflection, while two powerful dukes hiss strategy at each other just a few feet away. Any sign that you are listening, a shift in your eyes, a slight pause in your breathing, could be interpreted as espionage, with dire consequences. You spend a quiet moment dusting a bust of a long-dead, heavily bearded ancestor of the king. As you look at the cold stone face, you reflect on the structure of the household. Historians still argue whether the sprawling, often inefficient and overlapping departments of the royal household were primarily designed for genuine service and utility, or whether they existed mainly to offer prestigious salaried posts to the nobility and gentry, thus ensuring their loyalty to the crown. The system seemed needlessly complex, but perhaps that complexity was the point. A vast web of patronage and power, held together by the king at the centre. The fear of making a social blunder is constant. Unlike the kitchen, where a mistake earned you a lash or lost pay, a blunder above stairs could be a matter of social and political disgrace. You must learn the exact term of address for every single official, noble and royal family member. You must know when to stand, when to bow, and when to melt into the woodwork. You must never, ever turn your back on the king, and you must always yield the hallway to anyone even remotely higher on the ladder. You see a group of grooms of the great chamber approaching. They are wearing a slightly finer, more distinctive livery than yours, and they walk with an air of practised confidence. They're going to prepare the hall for an official reception. You immediately flatten yourself against the wall, bowing your head slightly, making yourself as small and unnoticeable as possible. They pass without a word, their boots clicking loudly, a brief sharp reminder of your relative insignificance. The greatest reward of being above stairs is not the slightly better food you might occasionally sneak, but the knowledge that you are a silent witness to history. You see the true faces of the powerful, the petty jealousies, the fatigue behind the elaborate smiles and the occasional flash of genuine human kindness. You are an extra in the grand play of the court, but your presence is essential. Your new orders arrive via a grim-faced yeoman usher. You're immediately detailed to the king's personal suite, the most private, protected rooms in the palace. You're to assist the valets and grooms in the preparation for the king's public levee, the ritual of waking and dressing. This is the moment when you will be closest to the source of all power, and where the rules of rank, movement and silence are enforced with the utmost severity. You straighten your frayed uniform and start walking toward the royal chambers, your heart thumping against your ribs, knowing that any mistake here will not just result in a lost day's pay, but perhaps a lost hand, or worse, the direct, terrifying wrath of your true master, the chief steward. You're now in the corridors of the king's personal apartments, and the atmosphere has shifted from intense labour to paralysing fear. If the kitchen had the tyranny of the master cook, this area has the cold, calculating dread of the chief steward, or the master of the household. This man is the ultimate authority over the thousands of staff who keep the palace running. He is the human manifestation of the rules, the budget, and the king's displeasure. Every servant, from the highest-ranking groom to the lowest scullion you remember from the steaming depths of Section 2, is subject to his absolute immediate power. You stand at attention near the king's antechamber, clutching a feather duster that suddenly feels like a useless, ridiculous weapon against the forces of bureaucracy. The chief steward appears not to stride, but to glide. He's usually an older nobleman, impeccably dressed, silent, and possessing an unsettling memory for every minor infraction and every staff member's face. He is the master of efficiency, and in the royal court, efficiency meant unquestioning obedience. This is the mainstream historical fact about the chief steward. He was effectively the chief operating officer of the royal household, a vast organisation that was often the single largest employer in the entire kingdom. His duties covered finance, justice, security and personnel. He was the one who oversaw the green cloth, the board that audited the expenses and governed the staff. His signature was required for your wages, your uniform and your inevitable dismissal. He didn't just manage the household, he was the household's supreme law, making him in many ways more consistently powerful in your daily life than the king himself. The chief steward rarely shouts. His power lies in his silence, his raised eyebrow, and the fact that he has the authority to make you disappear. A kitchen boy who dropped a tray, remember that mess from Section 2, might be whipped by the cook, but the steward could have him dismissed, locked in the palace jail, or even sent to the army, a life sentence of hard service. This is why his infrequent presence is like a sudden drop in temperature. You flatten yourself against the wall, trying to project an image of perfect, unwavering focus on the non-existent dust on the wainscoting. You witness a brief, tense encounter. A young yeoman of the cellar has approached the steward with a trembling ledger. He's reporting a shortage of fine imported Canary wine, a discrepancy of just a few bottles. The steward doesn't speak. He simply takes the ledger, taps the entry with a manicured finger, and looks at the yeoman. The silence stretches, thick and heavy. The yeoman turns ashen. The steward then simply initials the page, grants a few quiet words of instruction about better inventory management and moves on. No shouting, no lashing, but the message is clear. The yeoman now lives under a shadow of suspicion, his career likely stalled or ruined by those few missing bottles. You realise that petty theft, which you saw in the shadows and maybe engaged in yourself, perhaps just a piece of bread, is an act of incredible bravery or staggering foolishness under this man's jurisdiction. The steward is also the administrator of palace discipline. Every large royal court operated a rudimentary system of justice for its own staff. This leads to a quirky or fringe tidbit. In many early modern European courts, a servant could be sentenced to a period in the porter's lodge or the house of correction, a small dedicated prison wing within the palace walls. These were for infractions like drunkenness, fighting, theft of non-royal goods, or insolence. It was a terrifying reality. You could be scrubbing the floors one minute and thrown into the palace dungeon the next, all without ever leaving the king's property, and all thanks to the steward's judgment. Your new job as a page of the backstairs means you're running direct communications for the upper staff. You are a human email system. A gentleman of the bedchamber hands you a rolled scroll sealed with wax. Take this immediately to the master of the horse. No stops, no delays. If it is delayed, I will know you received the instruction with a sharp bow and dart away. You remember that massive palace? The one where you had to carry the king's chamber pot through its miles of corridors back in Section 1. Now you must sprint across it. You use the hidden network of spiral staircases and back passages you learned about earlier. The urgency is palpable. The master of the horse might be in the furthest stables, a quarter-mile walk away. If you stop to talk, to rest, or even to tie your shoe, and the gentleman of the bedchamber finds out, the consequences will be yours alone to bear. This pressure to move quickly and flawlessly is the most exhausting part of the job. It keeps your adrenaline perpetually high. The content of the message is irrelevant to you, but the speed is everything. As you run, your mind is racing, trying to recall the proper path through the palace's baffling layout. You recall the sheer weight and dampness of the laundry you were dealing with just hours ago. That was physically hard. This is psychologically crippling. You deliver the scroll, receive a perfunctory nod, and are immediately handed another message for a different official. Your entire day is now a blur of movement, dictated by the communications of the people who hold all the power. As you navigate the endless corridors, you ponder the immense, almost uncontrollable size of the royal staff. Historians still argue whether the sprawling, redundant, and often highly inefficient structure of the royal household was a deliberate strategy to prevent any single faction, person or department, including the chief steward himself, from gaining too much independent control. By scattering power and overlapping roles, the monarch ensured that all authority ultimately flowed back to the throne, even if it meant the constant, frustrating struggle of servants like you to know who to obey at any given time. You nearly collide with a junior member of the royal guard. You barely manage to stop and bow deeply, muttering an apology. The guard, though technically a servant, holds a military authority that supersedes yours. Another complicated wrinkle in the palace's social fabric. You continue your frantic run, your legs burning, the scroll feeling heavier with every stride. The steward, in his absolute authority, also manages the distribution of liveries, uniforms, and the quality of the board wages, food and lodging. If you are disliked, he can assign you to the worst sleeping quarters, the lowest quality food, or the hardest, most humiliating tasks. Your entire quality of life hangs on his distant approval. He is a distant god whose only sign of favour is his complete and total lack of acknowledgement. If he doesn't know your name, you're probably doing your job well. You finally return to the king's apartments, breathless, but on time. The gentleman of the bedchamber gives you a dismissive glance. Your flawless performance earns you precisely nothing. No praise, no thanks, just the absence of punishment. That is the highest reward you can hope for. Your next instruction, thankfully, involves a slightly slower ritual, but one of even greater intimacy and public spectacle, assisting in the preparation for the king's daily dressing ceremony. You are to stand by with the necessary accoutrements. You are transitioning from the fear of the steward to the formality of the king's person. You wipe the sweat from your brow, adjust your uniform, and prepare for the next, highly visible act of your strange, exhausting, and perilous life. You stand in the antechamber. The king's bedchamber doors close before you. The fear of the chief steward, remember that paralysing anxiety from the last section, is replaced by a different kind of dread, the terror of the intimate ritual. You're about to participate in the king's levee, a formal, public, and highly choreographed ceremony of waking and dressing the monarch. This is not about getting the king dressed efficiently. It is about displaying his power his accessibility, and the divine right of his rule to an audience of waiting courtiers. It is theatre, and you are the lowest stagehand. The doors open. You're ushered into the king's personal chamber, which is already starting to fill with the most important people in the kingdom, nobles, ambassadors, and favoured ministers, all eager for the first word or gesture from the sovereign. You, the page of the backstairs, must make yourself smaller than a shadow, gliding silently to your assigned position near the massive chest holding the royal linens. The king is barely stirring. A select few, the highest-ranking gentlemen of the bedchamber and the notorious groom of the stool, are already present. This is the moment of maximum proximity. You are closer to the king's actual person than almost anyone else in the palace, a privilege and a danger. This whole process is the mainstream historical fact of court life in many parts of Europe, particularly France and England during the 17th and 18th centuries. The levée, from the French lever, to rise, was a crucial political event. The act of giving the king his shirt, or even just his wash basin, was an honour reserved for the highest-ranking courtiers, signifying the political importance of the person performing the task. The whole morning was a carefully managed procession of ascending privilege, culminating in the king being fully dressed and ready to rule. Your role in this magnificent drama is decidedly less glamorous. You're there to provide the supplies and manage the logistics for the privileged courtiers. For example, as the First Lord of the Bedchamber solemnly hands the king his fine linen undershirt, a momentous honour. Your job is to retrieve the discarded nightshirt, fold it quickly, and ensure the next item of clothing, perhaps the king's hose, is ready for the appropriate duke to present. The temperature in the room is rising, not just from the fireplace you stoked hours ago, but from the combined breath and nervous energy of the dozens of courtiers packed into the room. You have to move quickly but without haste, always keeping your head bowed, your eyes focused on your task and your body angled away from the king to avoid any hint of disrespect. The king calls for his shave. You, or another junior page, must rush to the anteroom and retrieve the hot water, the razor, and the finest soap, placing them on a specific silver tray for the royal barber. The king's barber, often a man of surprising influence, is a skilled professional whose job is inherently risky. One twitch, one slip of the razor near the royal throat, and he might find himself in the tower. You watch him work, mesmerised by his steady hand. As you stand by the clothes chest, waiting for the king to call for his waistcoat, you notice the incredible expense of the garments. The embroidery is thick with gold and silver thread. The fabrics, velvet, satin and lace, are imported and breathtakingly fine. You're handling items that, if sold, could easily feed your entire family for a decade, or buy you the small farm you sometimes dream of owning. The ritual continues. The king calls for his hose. A specific lord, whose hereditary duty it is to present the king's stockings, bows low and offers them on a velvet cushion. Your job? To make sure the garters are ready. And then the shoes. They must be polished to a mirror sheen, a job likely performed by a higher-ranking yeoman, but you are the one who ensures the silver buckles are present and accounted for. This intimacy breeds a strange, silent understanding. You're close enough to hear the king's soft morning cough, to notice the slight tremor in his hand, or the weariness in his eyes before he adopts his royal mask. You see the man beneath the majesty, but you can never, ever acknowledge this sight. This leads to a quirky or fringe tidbit. In many courts, servants who were responsible for dressing or bathing the monarch were sometimes required to be unmarried, or at least celibate during their service, a rule intended to prevent the revelation of intimate royal secrets or physical details to the outside world. Your life is entirely consumed by the preservation of the king's image. A courtier whispers something into the king's ear as he is having his wig adjusted. The king smiles faintly and nods. A massive political decision has just been made, negotiated during the application of a fake curl. You were there, but you heard nothing, and you saw nothing. Your next task is one of the most stressful. The sword belt and the jewels. The sword must be perfectly buckled, the royal orders and medals attached with precision, and the jewels, which are incredibly heavy, must be secured. You hold the velvet box, your hands steady despite the hammering of your heart. You feel the weight of priceless diamonds and sapphires, a moment where you are literally carrying the wealth of the kingdom in your hands. A drop, a scratch, or a mistake in placement is unforgivable. As the king is finally helped into his final outer coat, the sign that the levée is nearly complete, the room is buzzing with activity. Ministers rush forward, bowing, receiving their brief, privileged moments of attention. You watch the scene unfold, a whirlwind of velvet, lace, and political manoeuvring. Historians still argue whether these elaborate, time-consuming rituals, like the levee and the dinner ceremony, which we'll get to later, were actually effective tools of governance, or whether they were simply costly, ritualistic traditions that only served to slow down the process of statecraft. Did the king truly rule better because he was dressed by a duke, or did it just provide an illusion of order? It's a question for the scholars, not for you, whose only concern is the placement of the king's glove. Finally, the king is fully dressed, his face a perfect mask of regal authority. The crowd parts. The king sweeps out of the chamber to begin his public duties. You exhale, realizing you've held your breath for over an hour. You have survived the most intimate and most watched ceremony of the day. Your service is not over, however. You must now begin the clean-up, clearing away the trays, polishing the silver, and ensuring the room is spotless for the king's return. You pick up a discarded piece of ribbon from the floor, your mind already jumping ahead. The morning's labour continues, but the next shift moves you away from the king's person and into the far more unpredictable, yet equally demanding world of the royal nurseries. You turn and walk toward the quiet, slightly isolated wing of the palace where the king's children are kept, preparing to trade the polished tyranny of the court for the tiny, adorable tyranny of the heirs. You leave the highly politicised atmosphere of the king's personal chambers, a world of silent fear and silk, and find yourself in the quieter, yet intensely demanding wing of the royal nurseries. This area is usually isolated, both for the children's safety from courtly contagion and intrigue, and to keep the noise of the young heirs away from the serious business of statecraft. You might think this shift offers a respite, but you soon discover that serving miniature royalty is a unique kind of high-stakes pressure, trading the tyranny of a king for the unpredictable tyranny of a child. Your new duty is to assist the high-ranking staff who run the nurseries, the governess for the girls, and the tutor for the boys, and their many subordinates, the rockers, nurses, and washers. You, as a junior page, are assigned to basic duties like fetching, carrying, cleaning, and sometimes the dreaded walking duty. This is the mainstream historical fact of royal nurseries. They were run with an incredible amount of formality and staffing, often resembling a self-contained small court. The children, even as infants, were not just children. They were precious commodities, the literal future of the dynasty. Their health, education, and manners were matters of state. A royal child's fever could cause political panic, and their smallest utterances were often analysed for signs of future greatness, or, more worryingly, signs of weakness. You enter the main nursery room. It's clean, but filled with the smell of milk, beeswax, and a persistent faint odour you immediately recognise from your earlier shift, emptying the chamber pots, even if the royal children's were handled by a slightly higher rank of servant. The furniture is heavy and ornate, but the toys are simple, wooden soldiers, dolls, and perhaps a small rocking horse, all watched over by the watchful eyes of the adult staff. Your first task is the bedding ceremony. The young prince, perhaps 5 years old and already aware of his absolute status, has had a restless night. You must assist the nurse in stripping and remaking the small luxurious bed. You're instructed to pay particular attention to the sheets. This leads to a quirky or fringe tidbit. In many royal European households, there was a deeply ingrained cultural fear of the supernatural harming the future monarch, sometimes leading to the peculiar practice of placing charms, relics, or protective verses hidden within the bedding or near the cradle. These were small superstitions meant to ward off illness or the evil eye, showing that even in a grand modern palace, ancient fears about dynastic survival persisted. You carefully adjust the mattress, ensuring the small embroidered pouch containing a dried herb or a piece of lucky wood remains undisturbed beneath the pillow. The prince wakes up. He is gorgeous in his finery, but demanding. He immediately stamps his foot and orders a piece of confectionery from a lower-ranking nurse. The nurse must obey instantly, because defying even a 5-year-old prince is an act of treasonous disrespect to the bloodline. You witness how rapidly these children learn their absolute power. They are miniature tyrants, benevolent one moment and screaming the next, and you must maintain a perfect, pleasant, and subservient demeanour regardless. Your assigned duty for the next 2 hours is walking the princess. This involves accompanying a 9-year-old girl, the eldest daughter, on her carefully supervised promenade through the palace gardens. This seems easy, a brief escape into the fresh air until you're instructed on the protocol. The princess is fragile, precious, and easily bored. You must walk 3 paces behind her, never speaking unless spoken to, but always listening to her endless stream of observations, complaints, and occasional direct demands. As you walk, the princess turns and points at a colourful butterfly. "Page," she commands, "catch it for me." You hesitate. You're wearing your best, though still threadbare, livery, and catching a butterfly involves a clumsy chase, and, possibly, tearing your coat or falling in the muddy verge. But you can't refuse. This is a direct command from the future. You launch into a surprisingly undignified chase, nearly tripping over your own feet, but you manage to cup the butterfly gently in your hands and present it to her. She inspects it for a moment, then, bored, simply says, "Let it go." Your entire effort was purely for her momentary entertainment. The demands are not always trivial. The tutor often requires your assistance during the prince's Latin lessons. You aren't teaching, you are the object lesson. If the prince correctly translates a passage about ancient Roman punishment, he might practice a gentle tap of the ruler on your outstretched hand, learning the proper way to administer justice. You take the blow silently, knowing that this is part of your service, to be a prop in the education of a future king. The ever-present worry in the nursery is illness. Childhood mortality rates are frighteningly high, even for royalty. The children are kept largely separated from the outside court, but they are constantly surrounded by staff, each a potential vector for smallpox, measles, or the dreaded consumption. You see the stress in the eyes of the nurses. A feverish night means every servant present will be placed under intense scrutiny, potentially facing blame if the illness worsens. You often overhear the governess and tutor discussing the prince's temperament and education. This brings us to a deep academic question. Historians still argue whether the education of a royal child, which focused heavily on classical literature, horsemanship, warfare, and statecraft, often at the expense of practical science or even modern languages, actually prepared them effectively for the complex challenges of governing in a rapidly changing world. You watch the prince struggle with a detailed map of the kingdom and wonder if he will ever truly understand the daily struggles of the people who make up that map, like you. Later, you are assigned to a mundane but critical task, polishing the silver toys. The royal children have dozens of small, intricately crafted items, rattles, miniature cups, and spoons, made of solid silver, both as a display of wealth and because silver was believed to be more hygienic than other metals. You carefully clean a small silver whistle, your reflection staring back at you from the polished surface. A tiny 3-year-old princess, trailing her heavily embroidered gown, toddles up to you. She doesn't scream or demand, she simply stares at your grimy hands, then at the whistle, and offers you a tiny, half-eaten gingerbread cookie. It's an act of unexpected kindness that cuts through the relentless formality of the palace. You manage a faint smile, bow your head, and politely refuse the cookie. You cannot accept food from royalty. It is a breach of protocol and could be misinterpreted. But the fleeting moment of humanity stays with you. Your shift ends with the afternoon nap. You help the exhausted nurse settle the youngest children, rocking a cradle until your arms ache. You leave the nursery, your mind buzzing with the dual reality of the room. It is both a place of great tenderness and immense political weight. You have survived the demands of the tiny tyrants, but your service in the palace means you are never truly clean, and the next reality you must face is the palace's profound and dangerous lack of sanitation. You trudge toward the service corridors, knowing that the grandeur of the palace is simply a facade built over a foundation of filth and disease. You recall the sheer labour of the laundry, remember the lie, and now you prepare to confront the pervasive structural flaws of palace hygiene. You have transitioned from the heat of the kitchens, Section 2, the damp of the laundry, Section 3, and the manufactured sweetness of the royal nurseries, Section 7. Now you are confronted with the true reality that underlies all the velvet and gold, the constant, pervasive filth of the royal palace. The pageantry you see in the throne room is merely a thin, gleaming veneer stretched over a dangerous foundation of pestilence. You are now engaged in general service duty in the public areas. You are constantly polishing brass and dusting the elaborate carved woodwork. But as you work, your senses betray the grandeur. The sweet smell of the rose and lavender potpourri that permeates the main halls is failing its job. It's struggling to mask the deep structural stink of 1,000 people living, eating and eliminating within close proximity without the benefit of modern sanitation. This is the mainstream historical fact that jars with the popular image of royalty. Palaces for centuries were profoundly unsanitary. Despite the presence of high-ranking officers like the groom of the stool and the yeoman of the ewer, and the constant labour of servants like you, the sheer density of people, lack of indoor plumbing, and reliance on crude waste disposal methods made these great houses breeding grounds for disease. The royal court was essentially a densely populated city operating within a single very large building, and the waste management capabilities were hopelessly inadequate for the scale. Your daily chores force you to confront this reality. You're often tasked with emptying the smaller, decentralised chamber pots, not just the king's, which is handled by a higher rank, but the pots from the many dozens of guests, minor nobles and upper staff who have been granted lodging within the palace. You carry these heavy, sloshing vessels down the narrow, dark service staircases, trying desperately not to spill the contents on your meagre uniform. You eventually reach the designated dumping areas, which are usually a trench or a cesspit outside the back walls, or sometimes, tragically, just dumped out of an upper window with a cursory shout of "Gardez l'eau!" Look out for the water, for those below. You shudder, remembering how narrowly you avoided a collision with the royal guard while running messages for the steward, Section 5. Imagine what a bucket of human waste would have done to your career. The constant dampness of the palace contributes to the problem. You see the signs of rot everywhere. Dank corners, peeling wallpaper in the lesser-used halls, and a persistent mossy growth on the north-facing stone walls. Rats and mice are a perpetual open secret. They scurry through the service tunnels, where you start your day at 4 a.m, remember, and even boldly dart across the polished floors of the back chambers. Traps are laid daily by the ratter, a specific lowly paid servant, but the animals are winning the war. The bedding in the palace, even the royal bedding you helped prepare, is often a haven for lice and fleas. Though the laundry staff, Section 3, boil and clean the linens regularly, the mattresses themselves, stuffed with straw or down, are rarely aired properly or replaced. You scratch an itchy spot on your wrist, a familiar, irritating part of palace life. As you sweep a quiet corner of the Great Hall, you spot a small telltale pile of something dried and grey. This leads to a fascinating and slightly disgusting quirky or fringe tidbit. In many palaces, one method of dealing with the prodigious amount of dog excrement left by the royal hounds, which often roamed freely as we'll discuss later, was to employ a specific poorly paid servant whose job was to collect the droppings, dry them, and then often sell them to local tanneries for use in the leather-making process. The palace, therefore, was not only a centre of governance, but also an inadvertent and profoundly smelly supplier to the local industry. It's a grim reminder that waste was sometimes a commodity. The problem of human waste extends to the official privies, the small rooms with the fixed wooden or stone seats, which merely dropped the waste into a deep shaft or a poorly constructed cesspool directly below. These shafts were rarely, if ever, properly cleaned, or mined, as they called it, by the incredibly brave or desperate gong-firmers. The accumulated filth would sit, stagnating, leaching into the surrounding soil, and emitting the foul, dangerous gases that everyone simply learned to live with. When disease strikes, the whole system collapses. A localized outbreak of influenza, or even something more sinister like typhus, carried by the lice, sweeps through the staff quarters first, which are usually cramped, poorly ventilated and overcrowded. You recall the sheer terror you felt in the nursery, knowing that illness there could be blamed on you. The king and queen, often shielded by being moved to a different residence, are protected, but the servants are expendable. You watch as a contingent of staff is summarily dismissed, not for any fault of their own, but simply because they coughed too violently or displayed a telltale rash. The chief steward's authority, Section 5, is swift and absolute in matters of public health panic. Better to throw out the slightly sick than risk the entire court. This constant threat of disease brings us to a major historical debate. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates and frequent sudden evacuations of royal courts were driven more by the lack of effective sewage and waste disposal systems, or by the fact that the palace served as a central hub for vast numbers of travellers, guests and food suppliers, constantly introducing new, virulent strains of illness from across the kingdom and abroad. Was the palace inherently unhealthy, or was it simply too popular for its own good? Your duties continue. You're handed a basket of dried rushes. These are used to cover the stone floors in the main halls, not just for warmth, but to absorb the spills, the mud tracked in from the outside, and yes, the inevitable droppings and sputum. The rushes are changed weekly, or sometimes less often, and by the end of their service they are a horrible compressed mat of compacted filth, providing another haven for pests. You sweep up the old foul layer, your nostrils burning from the stench of old beer, ancient grease, and something vaguely metallic. The irony of the grand, opulent facade is never lost on you. You stand on the freshly laid rushes, which smell faintly of lavender, and watch a richly dressed ambassador being ushered past, bowing low to the king's representative. He sees the dazzling crystal and the polished silver, but he doesn't smell the reality that you, the servant, live in every day. The palace is an illusion, sustained by your endless, thankless labour against the forces of decay and disease. Your next task is one of discretion and stealth. You have to move a sensitive parcel from one courtier's room to another without being seen, the very essence of palace intrigue. You're instructed to use the hidden passages. You welcome this new assignment, even with its high risk, because it allows you to escape the generalised, creeping filth of the main halls and retreat into the relative, if claustrophobic, sanctity of the palace's hidden infrastructure. You disappear down a narrow, unmarked doorway, eager to exchange the smell of pestilence for the dry, musty air of the secret ways. You slip through the narrow, unmarked door, leaving behind the suffocating grandeur and hidden filth. Remember that layer of old, compacted rushes from Section 8 of the main palace. You're now inside the walls, literally, entering a labyrinthine world known only to the staff, the secret passageways and back stairs. This is the nervous system of the palace, designed for stealth, efficiency, and above all the covert movement of servants and occasionally conspirators. The air here is thick with dust and smells strongly of old stone and mildew. The walls are rough-hewn, unlike the polished plaster of the staterooms. The light is minimal, relying on tiny, strategically placed oil lamps, or, more often, your own meagre rushlight, which you had to use during your 4 a.m. fire-stoking duty back in Section 1. You're moving a sensitive package, a small, wax-sealed box, from one courtier's apartment to another, a task that demands total invisibility. These passages, often called the backstairs or servants' tunnels, are the mainstream historical fact that allowed large royal households to function without appearing to function. They permitted the rapid movement of food, linens, messages and staff without disrupting the highly choreographed public life of the king and the court. They connected kitchens to dining halls, laundries to bedchambers, and crucially, the apartments of important courtiers to one another, facilitating discreet communication and political manoeuvring. You are moving at a brisk walk, your footsteps muffled by the dust on the stone floor. You know this map of shadows and tight corners better than the city streets outside the palace walls. It's a knowledge born of repeated frantic errands for the gentleman of the bedchamber and the yeoman, as you experienced running messages for the steward in Section 5. Any sound here is amplified, so you move with the utmost care, your breath held tight in your chest. You pause at a strategic point, a small, almost undetectable grille built into the stone wall of the passage. It is covered by a small decorative tapestry on the other side. This grille opens directly into the private drawing room of a powerful duke. This is one of the designated listening posts, not official, but understood by all the senior staff. Your job is not to actively listen, but to pause and ensure that no sensitive conversation is occurring that you might inadvertently disrupt by your passage. As you wait, you hear hushed, rapid voices. You catch fragments, names of foreign ambassadors, references to a tax dispute, and the mention of a specific date. You don't linger, but the fragments stick in your mind. This is the perilous reality of your current position. You are an involuntary eavesdropper. The very infrastructure built for your movement turns you into a potential spy. You dare not repeat anything you hear, not even to your closest fellow servants, who might betray you for a promotion. The smallest whisper of political intelligence from your mouth could land you in the palace's house of correction, or worse, remember the chief steward's absolute power. The politics of the court seep into the stones of the palace. The courier's apartment you are headed toward is known to be the centre of a faction, opposing the duke whose conversation you just overheard. Your delivery of the sealed box, which could contain anything from love letters to coded financial instructions, is a tiny, anonymous act in a huge political drama. You continue your journey, using a narrow spiral staircase that is so tight your shoulders scrape the damp stone on either side. You pass a small locked wooden door. This leads to a truly quirky or fringe tidbit concerning palace architecture. These hidden spaces were often used as temporary clandestine meeting points. Sometimes small, uncomfortable cells were built into these walls, not for long-term imprisonment, but as a place to detain a servant or guard immediately if they were caught in the act of treachery or pilfering. They were the architectural equivalent of a timeout, a terrifying sign that surveillance and punishment were built right into the fabric of the building. You finally emerge into the backstairs of the recipient's apartment, a dark corridor that is slightly less rough than the tunnel itself, a sign that you are closer to the above-stairs world, Section 4. You knock the specified secret pattern on the inner door. A nervous-looking valet opens it a crack, eyes darting up and down the corridor. He snatches the box from your hand without a word of thanks, and you're dismissed with a quick, dismissive wave. Your mission is complete. The isolation of these passages fosters a unique form of staff life. Sometimes you encounter other servants, usually those of similar rank, briefly sharing a moment of mutual exhaustion. You might see a kitchen hand sneaking a bottle of good wine destined for the royal table, an act of perquisite or pilfering which we'll address later, or a laundry girl stealing a moment away from the steaming coppers, Section 3. These encounters are always silent, a nod of recognition of shared risk before you both vanish back into the gloom. As you make your way back toward the general service area, you reflect on the strange nature of your knowledge. You know the palace in 3 dimensions, the grand public spectacle, the subterranean labour world, and this hidden secret realm. You know where the loose floorboards are, where the grills are placed, and which passages are rarely patrolled by the guards, Section 5. This hidden knowledge is your most valuable asset, and your greatest liability. The pervasive nature of this covert communication and intrigue leads to a fundamental debate. Historians still argue whether the high level of surveillance and potential espionage conducted by servants, either willingly or involuntarily, was a stabilising or a destabilising force in the royal court. Did the presence of so many eyes and ears help the king keep tabs on potentially disloyal nobles? Or did the constant flow of rumour and half-heard conversations through the back channels actually create more paranoia and political instability? You emerge back into the light of the main corridor. Your clothes are dusty, your nerves are frayed, but you delivered the box without being seen, without being heard, and without asking any questions. The immediate stress of the clandestine mission fades, replaced by the persistent, nagging social stress of the life above stairs. The next shift plunges you straight into the most complex social dynamic of the palace, the relationships, alliances, and rivalries among the thousands of people who share this strange world with you. You realise that while the king's politics play out in the halls, the real emotional survival of the servant class takes place in the dark corners, where forbidden affections and intense rivalries simmer. You turn toward the staff quarters, preparing to navigate the subtle, dangerous, and utterly human landscape of love and loathing among the staff. You leave the silence and shadow of the secret passages, where you are acting as an involuntary spy in Section 9, and enter the small, cramped, bustling world of the staff quarters and service halls. This is the place where the strict hierarchy of the court loosens just enough for real, messy, human relationships to bloom, or fester. After enduring the constant terror of the chief steward and the demanding silence of the levee, you crave the solace of community, but you quickly discover that the social landscape among your fellow servants is as complex and perilous as the politics of the nobles. The atmosphere here is a mixture of intense camaraderie and sharp-edged rivalry. You're all bound together by shared exhaustion, poor pay, and the impossible demands of the royalty. But you're also competing fiercely for the tiny scraps of prestige, better work assignments, and, most crucially, the opportunity for a promotion that might lift you out of the relentless drudgery. This intense social bond is the mainstream historical fact of the servant life. You spent far more time with your fellow staff than you did with your family, the nobles, or the king. The royal household was an insular, self-contained society. Your colleagues were your friends, your rivals, your only source of information, and the sole pool from which you could find a partner. Life in a palace meant a life governed by your relationships with the people around you, often leading to deep, lifelong bonds and equally deep, bitter feuds. The rivalries are usually rooted in the hierarchy. the one you learned about in Section 4. A junior scullion, whom you remember from the smoky depths of Section 2, might resent your slightly higher status as a page of the backstairs, viewing you as an arrogant climber. Meanwhile, you might look with suspicion on the yeoman of the ewer, who enjoys a cleaner job and better access to the upper floors. Every promotion for one person is a small blow to the ambitions of everyone else, and this resentment simmers below the surface of every polite staff interaction. You must be exceedingly careful about what you say, whom you trust, and to whom you complain. The most dangerous relationships, of course, are the forbidden ones. The palace is an enclosed world, and passion finds a way. You witness fleeting, furtive glances exchanged between a handsome footman and a quiet chambermaid. They snatch moments together in the linen closets, behind the heavy tapestries, or in the very secret passages you just navigated. This is a thrilling, reckless game, because such relationships, especially if they result in pregnancy, are strictly forbidden, often punishable by immediate dismissal for both parties, resulting in ruin. This dangerous reality of clandestine romance leads to a fascinating and slightly tragic quirky or fringe tidbit. In many royal households there were specific unwritten dating rules that evolved among the staff, often involving a system of tokens, subtle signals, or the use of go-betweens, trusted older servants to arrange meetings. Servants had little privacy and no time off, making the act of courting an incredibly complex logistical and social challenge, requiring a level of planning and stealth that would rival a political conspiracy. It was a life where the highest form of romantic gesture might be the quiet sharing of a rare piece of fruit or an extra hour's sleep. You have your own friendships. You gravitate towards others of your rank, often sharing your meagre evening meal, a piece of stale bread and cheese, in a quiet, cold corner of the staff annex. These conversations are your only release valve. You complain about the king's picky appetite, the impossible number of chamber pots, a constant plague, even after Section 8's cleaning efforts, and the constant nagging fear of the chief steward's whip, Section 5. These shared moments of dark humour and mutual misery are what keep you sane. But even these friendships are tested by the constant churn of the palace. If your friend is suddenly promoted, or if they are blamed for an offence and dismissed, the bond is abruptly broken. The palace offers no room for sentimentality. You must immediately distance yourself from anyone who is in disfavour, lest their misfortune reflect poorly on you. You learn to steel your heart, knowing that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. The loathing is usually targeted at those outside your immediate rank. The overly officious yeoman who hoards supplies, or the arrogant gentleman of the bedchamber who treats you with contempt, the very ones whose dressing ritual you endured in Section 6. The higher-ranking staff, though technically your colleagues, feel like a different species altogether, living off your labour and demanding total subservience. The dynamics of race, region, and language also play a role. If the king has recently welcomed foreign dignitaries, you might interact with their staff, a topic for a later section. These foreign servants, often speaking a different language and wearing distinctive livery, sometimes form their own tight-knit groups, viewing the native staff with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. You might exchange a friendly gesture with a Spanish cook's assistant, a small international moment in your otherwise provincial life. The complexity of these human dynamics is what keeps scholars busy. Historians still argue whether the high turnover rate among junior palace servants was primarily due to the harsh working conditions and low pay, or whether it was often a result of being driven out by the relentless social and political pressure exerted by their own immediate superiors and jealous colleagues. Was it the system that broke them, or the people within it? You witness a brief, sharp confrontation between two serving women over a misplaced item of laundry, a highly charged argument that quickly escalates to shouting and pulling hair. The staff overseer arrives and immediately breaks them up, doling out swift punishment. Both women are docked a week's wages, a staggering penalty. The overseer makes it clear that fighting will not be tolerated. Unity, or at least the appearance of unity, is necessary to keep the enormous household functioning. As the day winds down, you retreat to your shared, cramped sleeping quarters, a preview of Section 17. This space, your only true refuge, is also where these relationships play out in the smallest, most intimate space. You share a pallet, or at best a small cot, with 2 or 3 other people. The proximity forces a strained intimacy, where the smallest personality clash, a snore, a restlessness, a private letter read over a shoulder, can become a source of explosive conflict. You lay down, exhausted, the sounds of your colleagues' sleep and soft conversations filling the room. You reflect that despite the massive stone walls and the miles of hidden passages, there is nowhere in the palace where you are truly alone, truly invisible, or truly safe from the human drama that surrounds you. You are dragged from your sleep before dawn for a new assignment. Tonight, you're not stoking fires or scrubbing pots. You're moving to the spectacular heart of the palace's public life. You have been assigned to assist the staff responsible for one of the king's massive evening banquets. You're trading the cramped shadows for the blinding glare of the chandeliers and the secret whispers for the loud, elaborate ritual of royal entertainments. You've left the complex, whispering politics of the staff quarters, Section 10, for the high-wattage spectacle of the great banqueting hall. Tonight, the king is hosting a massive feast and ball for visiting dignitaries in the entire court. The atmosphere has shifted again. The silence of the levee and the scurry of the hidden passages are replaced by the thundering noise of preparation and the blinding collective brilliance of thousands of candles. Your job has moved from the scullery and the backstairs to the periphery of the main event. You are now a footman for the evening, assisting the senior officers who manage the dining process. Your livery, though still humble, is clean and pressed for the occasion. The pressure is immense. Unlike daily service, this is a show, a moment where the king's wealth and prestige are directly on display to his most important allies and rivals. Flawless execution is the only acceptable outcome. This massive feast is the mainstream historical fact that showcases royal power. Royal entertainments were never just about food. They were extravagant, theatrical displays of wealth, political manoeuvring, and dynastic confidence. A single banquet might feature dozens of courses, hundreds of dishes, and elaborate surtouts, centerpieces, that were often edible, sculpted marvels. These events served to impress foreign ambassadors, solidify the loyalty of the nobles, and consume staggering amounts of resources, ensuring that everyone understood the limitless capability of the king. Your first duty is the silver scullery. You are assigned to the frantic final polishing of the immense collection of royal plate, silver and gold cutlery, plates and serving dishes. You work alongside the yeoman of the plate, using chalk, vinegar and endless elbow grease until the metals gleam. The value of this silver, stacked high on wooden shelves, is truly incalculable. You're keenly aware that every piece is counted, and a single missing fork could mean immediate ruin. You remember the chief steward's terrifying focus on inventory, Section 5, and you rub harder. Next, you move into the hall itself for the table setting. The table stretches the length of the hall, draped in the finest white damask linen, which you or your colleagues struggled to clean back in Section 3. You place the polished silver, the fragile crystal goblets, and the linen napkins, which must be folded into elaborate specific shapes, a ship, a swan, or a crown, depending on the royal tradition. This precision is part of the theatricality. As you work, you notice the sheer volume of candelabra. Thousands of candles made of expensive purified beeswax, tallow candles made of animal fat, were often relegated to the staff quarters for their smoke and smell are being lit. The combined heat from the fires in the kitchen and the thousands of candles creates a heavy, oppressive warmth, but the light is magnificent, reflecting off the gold embroidery and the polished silver, creating a dazzling illusion of perfection. The food begins to arrive, carried by a procession of staff from the distant kitchens, the source of that unbearable heat and chaos as you know from Section 2. This is the moment of maximum risk. The dishes are heavy, hot, and highly complex. You are part of the chain, carrying a massive silver platter holding a roasted swan, complete with its feathers reattached, a truly quirky or fringe tidbit of medieval and Renaissance court cuisine. These elaborate, often symbolic dishes were known as subtleties, and were designed for visual impact rather than practicality, making the job of transporting them even more precarious. You move with agonizing slowness, terrified of tripping on the freshly laid rushes, the ones you saw being put down in Section 8. Once the service begins, you move from the dining room to the serving room, an adjacent area where the meat is carved, the sauces are decanted and the wine is prepared. You assist the Jura and the cupbearer, two high-ranking officials whose jobs are both practical and ceremonial. The cupbearer must taste the king's wine before it is served, a precaution against poisoning, but also a public display of trust and security. You watch him sip the wine, a brief silent moment of high-stakes drama. Your main job during the feast is twofold: fetching wine and clearing plates. The wine runs like a river. You must sprint back and forth to the cellar or the serving room to refill the decanters, ensuring no noble's goblet remains empty for more than a minute. Your speed and silence are critical. Clearing plates is a messy, fast-paced task. The nobles eat heartily, throwing their finished bones and scraps directly onto the floor, a common practice at the time, or handing the plates back in a great greasy stack. You have to remove this mess quickly and discreetly, carrying the huge weight of the used plateware back to the washhouse annex, where the laundry staff will now have to deal with food waste and dirty clothes, an absolute nightmare. After the dinner, the ball begins. The tables are swiftly cleared, you're exhausted from the clean-up, and the musicians strike up. The nobles, heavy with wine and food, begin to dance. Your duties transition to standing guard, fetching small refreshments, and ensuring the halls remain illuminated. You stand by the door, watching the shimmering spectacle. You see the princess, the tiny tyrant you chaperoned in Section 7, dressed in an elaborate ball gown, dancing with a foreign prince. You see the ambitious duke whose conversation you overheard through the grill, Section 9, engaging in a tense, smiling conversation with an ambassador. You are witnessing the raw power of the court, held together by the thin thread of your service. The long night brings inevitable human chaos. A visiting baron, heavily intoxicated, begins to argue loudly with another nobleman. Before a scene can erupt, the gentleman ushers and the guards swiftly move in. You watch as the baron is subtly, quietly escorted from the hall through a side door you know leads to the back corridors. The music does not pause, the dancing does not falter, the illusion of perfection is maintained. This constant performance raises a question that preoccupies those few scholars who study servant life. Historians still argue whether the relentless, physically and psychologically draining schedule of events, from dawn services to late-night balls, was simply a function of the monarch's social duties, or whether it was a deliberate, subtle tactic designed to keep the entire court, nobles and servants alike, constantly busy and exhausted, thus limiting their time and energy for organising dissent or conspiracy. The tired servant is a loyal servant. As the night nears its end and the candles begin to sputter, you are utterly spent. Your back aches from carrying the heavy trays, your feet burn from hours of standing and running, and your head pounds from the heat and the noise. You feel like a clock spring wound too tight. Your assignment isn't done until the last noble has stumbled off to their chambers. You are then tasked with the final, grim work, extinguishing the hundreds of flickering candles, which often involves a dangerous, dizzying climb on unsteady ladders. You perform this task knowing that you are heading into the coldest, most solitary shift of the palace, the long, cold night of candle duty. You turn your back on the mess of the banquet hall, the discarded scraps, the scattered silver, and the heavy air, and move toward the dark corners where you will spend the hours until dawn, alone with the flame. The immense clean-up from the royal ball, Section 11, is finally finished. The last of the nobles have stumbled back to their chambers, and the great hall is now a landscape of scattered silver, extinguished candles, and lingering smells of stale wine and perfume. You are bone-weary, but your duty doesn't allow for rest. Your next assignment plunges you into a different sort of chaos. The subtle, culturally charged environment of the foreign quarters. A major ambassadorial delegation, perhaps from Spain or a powerful German state, has been lodged in a specific wing of the palace. You're assigned to assist the staff responsible for their comfort and security. This is a temporary high-pressure duty that trades the familiar rules of your own court for the confusing, often contradictory customs of a foreign power. This interaction is the mainstream historical fact of large royal courts. They were constantly receiving foreign dignitaries, ambassadors, and their sprawling retinues. This required the host palace to dedicate entire wings, and often specialised staff, to the diplomatic guests. These exchanges were less about hospitality, and more about demonstrating national wealth, power, and cultural superiority, meaning your performance was now a matter of international diplomacy, not just domestic service. A slight perceived insult to an ambassador's valet could become a small diplomatic incident. You enter the foreign quarters, and the shift is palpable. The livery worn by the visiting staff is different, perhaps brighter, with distinct national colours or symbols. The language barrier is immediate. You might only know a few words of their tongue, and they few of yours. forcing communication into a strained combination of pointing, gesturing, and relying on one or two staff members who have a rudimentary understanding of the other's speech. Your job is mainly logistical, ensuring that the foreign servants have fresh water, sufficient wood for their fires, and that their own specific dietary requests, which are often bafflingly different from the heavy English diet, are relayed to the kitchens. You remember the oppressive heat and fear of the master cook, section 2. Now he is doubly stressed trying to produce, for example, a delicate Spanish stew instead of a massive roasted beef. You encounter the chief valet of the foreign ambassador. He is impeccably dressed in his national livery and treats you with a formal, distant courtesy, which is almost more unnerving than the casual contempt of your own grooms, who you resent from section 10. You must bow lower, hold the door longer, and adhere to a system of address that is entirely new to you. You're tasked with showing a junior foreign page to the palace's stable block, where the ambassador's horses are stabled. As you walk through the back corridors, you try to make small, friendly conversation, mostly through gestures. He shows you a strange, small, coin-like medal pinned to his tunic. This leads to a fascinating, quirky or fringe tidbit about diplomatic service. Many foreign courts issued their household staff with special travel passes, or even minor medals, specifically designed to grant them certain immunities or privileges when travelling abroad with their master, protecting them from the harsher discipline often faced by servants in foreign lands. He gestures to it proudly, and you realise he has a layer of protection that you, the native servant, entirely lack. The stress comes from the clash of customs. You might be asked to provide something that is completely unavailable in your palace's stores, or to perform a duty that is considered demeaning in your own household but mandatory in theirs. For example, some courts considered the use of snuff, powdered tobacco, highly refined, and you might be asked to prepare the ambassador's snuff box, a task usually handled by a higher-ranking valet, but which you must perform now to avoid a diplomatic slight. You also become an inadvertent low-level collector of intelligence. As you wait in the antechambers, you watch the interactions between the foreign staff and the local staff. You observe which of your colleagues are being overly friendly with the foreign cooks, perhaps trying to sneak a taste of their exotic food, and which of them are keeping a watchful, suspicious distance. You know that everyone in the palace is evaluating the visitors, trying to gauge their master's political standing and their national character. This constant high-stakes exposure to different cultures raises a profound question that often vexes scholars. Historians still argue whether the movement of large diplomatic retinues and their accompanying servants primarily facilitated the cultural exchange of ideas, technologies, and fashions between nations, or whether it was a more significant vector for the transmission of epidemic diseases, which the palace struggled with immensely, as you know from Section 8, and political espionage among the courts of Europe. Was the foreign quarter a pathway for progress, or a gateway for plague and secrets? You're given a small sealed packet and instructed to deliver it to the ambassador's personal secretary. This mission feels similar to the clandestine errand you ran earlier through the secret passages, Section 9, but the risk is amplified by the international dimension. If you are caught with this packet by your own chief steward, you could be accused of aiding foreign intrigue. You slip it quickly into your tunic and nod solemnly. As you navigate the palace with a foreign page, he points to the large, elaborate royal crest carved above a doorway. He says a single, foreign word that you recognise as meaning king. You nod. He then points to the gold gilding on the wall and says a different word, which you recognise as money. You realise that, despite the differences in livery, language and custom, you both share the same fundamental understanding of the palace. It is a place of absolute power and unimaginable wealth, built and maintained by your labour. The exchange is not always hostile. You find a moment to sit quietly with a foreign laundrywoman who is struggling with a heavy basket of silks, much like the ones you wrestled with in Section 3. Despite the language barrier, the mutual recognition of back-breaking, endless toil for fickle masters is a shared language. You help her lift the basket, and she rewards you with a piece of dried, unfamiliar fruit, a small, sweet token of international solidarity among the serving class. The day ends, and the delegation is preparing for a public audience. You're dismissed from the foreign quarters. You have survived the challenge of translating demands, respecting alien customs, and remaining discreet under foreign surveillance. You feel a strange sense of expansion. The palace is no longer just your king's domain, but a small window onto the whole world. Your next task pulls you out of the palace's cultural interior and into its rougher, more practical exterior, the guard barracks and the stable yards. You're trading the delicate silks and careful courtesies of the foreign quarters for the simpler, louder, and often more physically demanding world of the guard and the stable, where the service is less about bows and more about muscle and grit. You've navigated the foreign formalities, Section 12, and now you're moving out of the palace's silk and silver interior and into the rougher, more elemental world of the stables and the guardhouse. This shift is jarring. The air is thick with the smell of horse sweat, leather, straw and gunpowder, a welcome honest smell compared to the perfumed filth of the main halls, Section 8. You are temporarily assigned to assist the support staff of these two critical departments. The stables are vast, often the largest ancillary building in the royal complex, housing dozens, sometimes hundreds, of the king's horses, from massive war horses and ceremonial mounts to swift hunting ponies and carriages horses. Your duty here is to assist the grooms and stable boys, a cohort known for being physically tough, less constrained by court etiquette, and possessing a simple, blunt camaraderie. The relationship between the palace and its animals is the mainstream historical fact here. A monarch's power was often literally measured by the quality and quantity of his horses. They were essential for war, transport, ceremony and hunting. The stables were run with the efficiency of a military unit managed by the high-ranking master of the horse, a position of immense prestige and often political leverage. Your job is menial, carrying buckets of feed, mucking out stalls, and running messages between the head groom and the farriers. You're introduced to the true scale of the work. You heave heavy bales of hay, your muscles protesting after the long night of the ball, Section 11. The horses are magnificent, treated with far more care and expense than you are. You see a royal stallion being fitted with a new, elaborately silver-studded bridle, worth more than a village's annual tax revenue. You envy the simple, clear demands of the horses. They require food, water, and cleaning, not political deference or perfect silence. As you clean the king's favourite hound kennel, a duty that reminds you of the general animal waste problem the palace faced, Section 8, you encounter a truly quirky or fringe tidbit of palace life, the royal whipper-in or master of the hounds. Not only did they manage the packs of hunting dogs, but these large, specialised packs were sometimes kept inside the palace to demonstrate the king's passion for the hunt, often sleeping on rush-covered floors right outside the king's or queen's apartments. Managing the feeding and constant cleaning required by these animals, who were often far dirtier than the horses, was a massive logistical challenge, making their care another major drain on staff time and resources. You marvel at the fact that these loud, slobbery creatures have more access to the royal presence than you do. The next shift takes you to the guardhouse. While the household staff, like you, are under the command of the chief steward, the palace guards are a military unit, answering to a different hierarchy in the military chain of command. They are the visible manifestation of the king's authority and are responsible for the physical security of the palace, the defence of the royal person, and keeping order among the crowds and sometimes the servants, who you remember the steward could sentence to the army in Section 5. You run errands for the captain of the guard, a grizzled, unimpressed man who treats you with the same rough courtesy as the stable hands. You deliver polished breastplates to the armoury and carry buckets of water to the guard posts. The guards themselves are armed, uniformed and bored. Their existence is long hours of standing at attention, often leading to a tense, simmering irritability. You witness a brief, sharp interaction, where a junior guard is reprimanded for falling asleep on duty. The punishment is immediate, physical, and highly visible, a reminder that discipline in the military world is far swifter and less nuanced than the psychological warfare of the chief steward. You realise that while your life is fraught with political danger, Section 9, theirs is fraught with physical danger. Both forms of service carry fatal risks. The intersection of these two rough, essential departments leads to a major question that historians constantly revisit. Historians still argue whether the high administrative costs and complex infrastructure required to maintain the royal stable and the royal guard, both massive budget items, were primarily seen by the monarchs as necessary military and security expenditures, or if they were deliberately used as highly visible symbols of power, designed to project authority both domestically and internationally. Was it about defence, or about dazzling display? Your job requires you to fetch an item from the king's private hunting lodge, located just outside the main palace grounds. This means you have to leave the complex. You approach the main gates, where a guard checks your papers, a small stamped pass proving you are on legitimate duty. This is a moment of profound but fleeting freedom. You step outside the palace walls. The noise of the city, the shouts of vendors, the clatter of carts, the sheer smell of the marketplace, is overwhelming after the carefully controlled environment of the court. It's a riot of humanity that you haven't truly experienced since you started your service. You realize how profoundly the palace isolates you. You complete your errand at the lodge, quickly retrieving the required hunting horn. The journey back to the gates is a strange mix of terror and elation. Terror, because you are outside the protection of the palace walls and could easily be robbed or press-ganged. And elation, because for 20 minutes you were a person, not a page. You managed to sneak a small piece of fruit, a sweet, tangy peach, from a market stall with the last of your coppers, a small act of self-gratification you dare not share. You return to the guard post, submit to the check, and pass back into the rigid order of the king's domain. You clutch the peach, saving the precious moment of flavour for the dark of your tiny shared room. You have survived the physical demands of the stables and the strict discipline of the guard. You're dismissed from the service halls. The exhaustion is deep, but the taste of that brief freedom lingers. This fleeting exposure to the city reminds you that there is a world beyond the palace and that the ultimate dream is not promotion, but escape. You look forward to the next very rare moment when you can step out of the gilded cage and experience a taste of freedom. Your precious, highly conditional days off. You're exhausted from the physical labour of the stables and the guardhouse. Section 13. Your muscles aching, but a small piece of paper in your pocket, a signed pass from the yeoman usher, promises a reprieve. You have been granted a day off. This is an incredibly rare and precious occurrence. A brief 24-hour escape from the suffocating routine, hierarchy and paranoia of the royal palace. Getting this pass was a bureaucratic nightmare. You had to petition your immediate superior, who passed it up the chain to the chief steward's office, the seat of all authority, as you know from Section 5, where it was checked against your service record, the palace calendar, and the current needs of the household. The granting of a day of liberty is not a right. It is a conditional, revocable privilege, a fact that underlines the entire nature of your service. The moment you step through the main palace gates, the same gates you passed through on your errand to the hunting lodge, the weight lifts. The noise of the city, which was overwhelming on your last brief foray outside, is now exhilarating. The smells of the market, the dust, the street food. It's a chaotic symphony of freedom. You're no longer a page, a footman, or a scullion. You are, briefly, just a person. This experience highlights the mainstream historical fact that most residential staff in large households, especially royal ones, had extremely limited personal time and almost no privacy. The palace was their life, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Days off were rare, maybe a handful a year, and were always dependent on the monarch's schedule. This limited freedom was necessary to prevent the servant from feeling entirely caged, but it also ensured they never truly integrated back into the outside world, creating a permanent psychological barrier between palace life and city life. Your first destination is almost certainly not home, but the staff inn or a specific tavern near the palace walls that caters primarily to servants. You go there not for the strong beer, though you certainly drink it, but for the conversation. Away from the palace's hidden grills, Section 9, and the ears of the overseers, you can finally speak freely, trading gossip, complaints, and hopes with other servants from different departments and different households. You sit down and order a cheap pint of ale. You complain about the impossible laundry standards, Section 3, the suffocating heat of the kitchens, Section 2, and the arrogance of the gentlemen of the bedchamber, Section 6. The camaraderie here is different from the strained relationships you manage inside, Section 10. This is a shared vocal relief, and it's a necessary cleansing ritual. You encounter an older servant, a retired yeoman who managed to secure a small pension. He tells you a story about his youth, a truly quirky or fringe tidbit about a traditional holiday for palace staff known as Serving Man Sunday, or similar local variants. This was an unofficial day, sometimes tolerated by the nobility, where the roles were briefly and humorously reversed. Junior servants would dress up in the faded finery of their superiors, put on mock courtly airs, and parody the rigid etiquette of the palace, often in a designated tavern or private hall. It was a vital, controlled explosion of satire and resentment, a chance to mock the system that enslaved them, before having to return to their subservient reality. Your limited funds mean you must budget this freedom. Most of your small wages, which you earn constantly but receive infrequently, are spent on necessities, replacing worn shoes, perhaps a new shirt, or sending a meagre amount home to your family in the country. You find a stall selling second-hand clothes, searching for something drab and nondescript, anything to conceal the fact that you are a palace servant, a target for pickpockets who know you must have some silver hidden away. You allow yourself one small luxury, a visit to a playhouse or a puppet show. It's loud, crude, and infinitely more entertaining than the forced pageantry of the royal banquets, Section 11. For a few hours, you sit in the dark, laughing with strangers, entirely forgetting the need to bow, to remain silent, or to fear the chief steward's sudden presence. As the day wears on, a strange anxiety begins to creep in. The outside world, which felt so liberating hours ago, now feels disorganised, risky, and a little overwhelming. You realise how much the palace, for all its cruelty, provides a terrifying stability. Inside you know the rules, even if they are harsh. Outside the risks are arbitrary. Mugging, hunger, unemployment. You understand now why many servants, despite the misery, choose to remain for decades. This psychological divide is central to a long-standing academic question. Historians still argue whether the extreme insularity and strict discipline of the royal household intentionally fostered a psychological dependence in its staff, making the prospect of leaving and facing the economic uncertainty of the outside world appear far more terrifying than enduring the hardships of palace service. Was the palace a prison or a distorted form of security? You use the last of your free time to visit your sister who works as a laundress for a wealthy merchant family across town. The difference in her working life is immediate. Less pomp, less danger, but possibly more constant, grueling work for a less secure master. You share the peach you smuggled back from your stable run, Section 13, and tell her vague, laundered stories of the palace's grandeur, omitting the constant fear and the unspeakable filth, Section 8. You exchange promises to see each other soon, knowing that soon might mean 6 months. As dusk approaches, the need to return becomes an insistent heavy pull. To be late is to invite immediate and severe punishment, the loss of your already meagre pay, and possibly instant dismissal. You turn your back on the vibrant, messy city and walk toward the imposing, silent walls of the king's palace. You pass back through the gate, showing your signed pass. The guard nods, barely looking at you. You're instantly reabsorbed into the system. The civilian clothes, the fleeting freedom, the laughter, it all evaporates the moment you step back onto the king's ground. You're a servant again. You're immediately directed to a new, unsettling task. The palace has been experiencing worrying shortages in its wine cellar and linen stores. The chief steward's office suspects a deep network of pilfering, petty theft, and the taking of perquisites. Your next duty is to assist in a sudden, intense inventory of the stores, a task that forces you to confront the dark truth of palace survival: corruption and theft. The brief, intoxicating taste of freedom, Section 14, is immediately soured by your new assignment. You're not only back in the palace, you're now participating in its moral compromise. The chief steward's office has launched a sudden, intense crackdown on corruption and theft, and you, as a page with knowledge of the back passages, Section 9, and the staff's social dynamics in Section 10, are now an unwilling tool in the investigation. You report to the yeoman of the stores, a suspicious, beady-eyed official who controls the massive inventory of palace supplies, everything from wax candles and fine linens to imported wine and spices. The room itself is a treasure trove, packed floor to ceiling with goods, all under lock and key. Your job is to assist in the count, comparing the physical stock to the ledger books, a tedious process designed to uncover any discrepancies. This sudden scrutiny highlights the mainstream historical fact that grand households and royal palaces were perpetually plagued by theft and pilfering. The sheer volume of high-value goods passing through the hands of hundreds of low-paid servants made corruption inevitable. This was often mitigated, or at least managed, by a semi-official system known as perquisites or perks. These were accepted customary allowances for staff to take certain scraps, drippings, candle ends, or worn-out items as part of their compensation. It was a grey area, a necessary evil to supplement meagre wages and keep the servants from taking more valuable items. As you count bolts of imported Venetian lace, the yeoman mutters darkly about the disappearance of a dozen bottles of the king's favourite Madeira wine. The theft of a valuable item like wine or silver, which you polished in Section 11, is a capital offence, but the lines are constantly blurred. If you take a handful of kitchen herbs, that's a perquisite. If you take a silver spoon, that's hanging. You know the reality, having lived it yourself. Remember that small piece of bread you risked taking back in Section 2, or the peach you successfully smuggled in after your time in the stable block, Section 13. Survival in this system often depended on minor corruption. The larder boys sneak meat scraps, the grooms take old, worn leather for shoe repair, and the laundry maids take small pieces of worn-out linen to patch their own clothes. It is an accepted, necessary cost of service, but when the losses become too great, the steward, Section 5, swoops in with his terrifying authority. You notice the ledger itself seems to have been cooked. The yeoman is writing down numbers that don't quite match the physical count, but always in the palace's favour, masking his own theft and incompetence. He looks at you with a sharp, warning glance, ensuring you understand that seeing this discrepancy is a matter of life and death, and that you must not report it. You are now complicit, a tiny, silent part of the system's rot. The corruption runs from the top of the servant class downward, trapping everyone in its web. During the count of the wax candles, an expensive commodity essential for the endless palace illumination, the yeoman shows you an entry. A high-ranking gentleman of the bedchamber, the very sort you assisted in Section 6, has signed out far more candles than could possibly be used. This leads to a fascinating and cynical quirky or fringe tidbit regarding high-level perquisites. High-ranking courtiers and favoured servants were often permitted to take the unburned candle stumps from the royal apartments as part of their unofficial income. They wouldn't burn the wax, they would sell the expensive purified beeswax on the open market for a handsome profit. This means the highest ranks were often the biggest thieves. Only their actions were sanctioned by custom, while your meagre taking of a crust of bread could cost you your life. The pressure mounts when the yeoman begins to question you directly about your colleagues. Did you see the master cook's assistant handling any extra wine barrels? Did the laundry staff seem overly concerned with the discarded linens? Your knowledge of the staff's intimate relationships, Section 10, is being exploited. You must lie convincingly, protecting your friends and yourself, while giving the yeoman just enough vague information to satisfy his need for a scapegoat. You realise the chief steward rarely hunts the big fish. He usually just needs a visible example, a frightened junior servant who can be publicly punished to restore the illusion of order. The internal investigation leads to the immediate visible dismissal of a junior pantry hand, a young man you barely knew. He's accused of pilfering a small amount of sugar, a precious and expensive spice. He's dragged through the courtyard, his uniform ripped from his back, his wages confiscated, and he is thrown out the gate with nothing but the clothes on his back. You watch the spectacle, the chief steward's men ensuring the lesson is learned by all. Fear runs like a current through the staff. The punishment is grossly disproportionate, but its purpose is clear: to instill terror. This arbitrary enforcement of rules brings to the forefront a major question for social historians. Historians still argue whether the practice of perquisites and tolerated theft, followed by the occasional brutal crackdown and scapegoating, was a calculated managerial technique designed to keep the servant class perpetually insecure and reliant on the court's unpredictable mercy, or if it was simply a natural disorganised result of a grossly underpaid workforce and an inefficient large bureaucracy. Was the insecurity intentional, or just a byproduct of chaos? You finish the count, your hands smelling of dust and fine linen, your conscience heavy with complicity. The inventory is balanced thanks to the yeoman's creative accounting and your silence. You have helped hide the systemic rot, and in doing so, you have survived another day. You retreat from the stores, feeling more like a conspirator than a servant. The bell in the courtyard begins to chime softly, signalling the end of the public day. The halls begin to empty. The nobles retreat to their private chambers. The noise of the kitchens fades. The palace is entering its long period of darkness and quiet. Your next duty is one of solitude, silence, and persistent physical danger. You're assigned to the most solitary shift of the palace. The lighting, guardianship, and eventual extinguishing of the thousands of lamps and candles needed to maintain the illusion of light. You turn towards the main halls, steeling yourself for the long cold nights ahead, a shift where your only company is the endless flickering flame. The palace, having disgorged its nobles and finished its nightly political scheming, which you saw firsthand while running messages in Section 9 and navigating the corruption in Section 15, settles into a vast, chilling silence. You have moved into the final darkest shift of your day, candle duty. Your job is the lighting, guarding and eventually extinguishing of the thousands of light sources that keep the royal residence functional, and more importantly, safe through the long night. You are now a figure of profound solitude. The immense halls, so dazzlingly bright during the banquet, Section 11, are now cavernous and spooky, illuminated only by the flicker of the carefully placed oil lamps and the faint glow spilling from the private chambers. The air has grown significantly colder, the heat from the day's fires having long since dissipated into the stone structure. Your supplies are a heavy leather pouch containing wicks, flints, steel, and a carefully rationed quantity of expensive beeswax candles. You remember the high cost of this wax and the corruption involved in its management, Section 15. You climb the tall, wobbly step ladders, moving from candelabra to wall sconce, trimming wicks, replacing spent candles, and ensuring that the light is both functional and aesthetically pleasing. This intense focus on light sources is the mainstream historical fact that characterized large palace living. Illumination was a huge, continuous logistical undertaking and a massive expense. Before gaslight or electricity, every room, every corridor, and every public space had to be manually lit, maintained, and extinguished by servants like you. This required specialized staff, the candle makers and chandlers, and a small army of junior servants to manage the daily consumption of hundreds of pounds of wax, oil, and wicks. The cost of light alone was a significant fraction of the entire royal household's operational budget. Your main fear in this job is not the dark, but the fire. The palace is a structure of dry wood, fine tapestries, and rush-covered floors, which you saw being laid in Section 8, and it is literally built around hundreds of open flames. A single falling spark, an untrimmed wick, or a candle placed too close to a curtain could engulf a wing of the palace in minutes. You move with a practiced, neurotic care, constantly checking the light sources you have just trimmed, your heart thumping at the thought of the consequences of an accident. The Chief Steward's authority, Section 5, in case of a fire would be terrifying and absolute. As you patrol the outer halls, checking the security lamps near the windows, you become keenly aware of the sounds of the night. The palace seems to breathe around you. The groan of settling timbers, the rustle of rats in the walls, a persistent, grim presence, as you know from Section 8, and the rhythmic footsteps of the Royal Guard, Section 13, on their long, slow patrols. You come across a set of lamps in a quiet, unused receiving hall. You realise they were left burning after a minor late-night meeting. You reach up to extinguish them, an act that saves precious wax and, more importantly, removes a fire risk. This leads to a quiet, slightly subversive, quirky or fringe tidbit of servant survival. In many royal households, junior servants developed a habit of secretly nicking the wick, trimming a candle wick just enough to make it burn slightly dimmer, or even extinguishing lamps in unused rooms ahead of schedule. This was done not just to save money, though sometimes they could pilfer the wax scraps, but to reduce the hours of mandatory, dangerous labour. This small, silent rebellion against the tyranny of light was a tiny way to reclaim minutes of their own lives. The hours stretch out, cold and slow. You have no one to talk to, no one to share a whispered joke with, as you might have with your colleagues in Section 10. The solitude is a kind of mental exhaustion in itself. You fight the pervasive, bone-deep sleepiness, knowing that falling asleep could cost you your life, or at least your livelihood. You trudge the corridors, your mind a blank slate of fatigue, focusing only on the next flickering flame. You pause in a small windowless alcove, your assigned break spot. You take out the small, hard piece of bread you saved from your last meagre meal and eat it slowly. You sit near a small oil lamp, the only light source that is yours alone, and warm your freezing hands. You close your eyes for a brief, dangerous moment, reflecting on the endless cycle. Wake before dawn, Section 1. Scrub the filth, run the messages, dress the king, Section 6. Escape the Chief Steward, Endure the chaos, and now guard the dark. The stillness of the palace allows you to reflect on the great mystery that surrounds this very service. Historians still argue whether the practice of maintaining such continuous, excessive illumination in royal courts during the night was primarily a function of security, making it harder for intruders to hide and for conspiracies to bloom, or if it was mainly a symbolic demonstration of the king's absolute power, a statement that even the natural darkness of the night could not challenge the majesty and control of the monarch. Was the light for seeing or for showing off? As dawn approaches, your final critical duty begins, the official extinguishing of the ceremonial lights. You move through the grandest halls, the ones that will soon host the next day's ceremonies. You use a long, specialised copper snuffer, never blowing out the flame, which is seen as disrespectful and spreads soot, to carefully extinguish the thousands of candles in the great candelabra. As the last major flame dies, the room is plunged into a perfect anticipatory darkness, waiting for the natural light to fill it. You have done your job flawlessly. The palace is safe, dark, and ready for its reawakening. You collect your tools, your uniform covered in thin layers of grease and wax. Your shift is officially over, but you are not dismissed. You are simply sent to your quarters, a tiny, cramped space that is your only sanctuary. You look forward not to rest, but to the few moments where you can shed the physical and psychological burden of your duty and reclaim your body. You turn toward the staff wing, anticipating the small, shared, and deeply personal space that is your own room. You have finished the solitary, chilling duty of the long night, Section 16, extinguishing the last ceremonial lights and ensuring the fire risk is contained. You are utterly spent, your body aching from the endless varied labour, from the physical hall of laundry, Section 3, and stable work, Section 13, to the psychological stress of silence and surveillance, Sections 5 and 9. Now, you're granted the few precious hours that are truly your own. You turn toward the staff wing, toward the cramped, cold space that is euphemistically called your own room. The journey there is a walk through the palace's architectural contempt for its lower staff. You pass from the gilded, expansive staterooms to narrow, unheated corridors, up hidden, unlit service stairs, and finally arrive in an annex tucked away on an upper floor or deep in a remote wing, a place where noise, mess, and the simple fact of your existence won't bother the royalty or the high-ranking courtiers. You open the door to your room, which is not yours at all, but a space shared with at least 3, sometimes 4, other junior servants of similar rank, perhaps a kitchen hand, whom you remember from the smoky chaos of Section 2, a laundry girl, and another page. The room is tiny, barely large enough for the sleeping arrangements. The air is stale, heavy with the composite scent of 4 tired people, old wool and unwashed bodies. There is no fire here, and the cold is immediate and biting. This cramped shared living arrangement is the mainstream historical fact of domestic service in large palaces and households. Servants were generally provided with free room and board, the board wages, but the quality of that lodging was directly proportional to your rank. The highest-ranking gentleman of the bedchamber might have a decent private room near the royal apartments. The lowest-ranking staff, like you, were crammed together, often sleeping 2 to a small cot, or on thin straw mattresses laid directly on the wooden floor. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the nobility. You have a few possessions, a small wooden chest that serves as a lockbox and a stool, containing your meagre uniform, which is now desperately due, for a change and a scrub, a few letters from home, and perhaps a small cherished religious relic. This chest represents your only claim to personal space and security, against the minor pilfering that often occurs even among friends, the low-level corruption you're keenly aware of from Section 15. You quickly undress, shedding your uniform, the uniform that marks you as a servant and dictates your every action. This simple act of putting on your own rough, simple nightshirt is the moment you reclaim your identity. It's the briefest psychological relief. You no longer need to be perfectly silent, perfectly deferential, or perfectly alert. The social dynamics you navigate during the day, Section 10, continue here, only compressed into a smaller, more intimate space. Your roommates are already asleep, they're breathing heavy and rhythmic. You must move with extreme care not to wake them, but they also offer a strange comfort. You are not alone, and the shared exhaustion creates a silent, mutually recognised truce. You crawl onto your straw pallet. It is lumpy and cold. You pull your thin blanket over you, trying to steal a few degrees of warmth from the rough linen. Sleep is not a restful sinking, but a struggle to quiet the racing thoughts of the day, the terror of the chief steward, the risk of fire, the complex web of political whispers you overheard through the back channels. You watch the moonlight filtering through the single, small, unheated window. You notice a small, carved symbol scratched into the wooden wall near your pallet, a tiny cross, or perhaps an initial. This leads to a quiet, often overlooked quirky or fringe tidbit about servant life. Despite the lack of privacy, servants often left small clandestine markers, initials, simple drawings, or dates, on the walls or beams of their shared quarters. These were tiny, almost defiant acts of personalisation, declarations of individual identity in a system designed to strip them of it. Your bed space, however cramped, was your physical address in the world, and these marks were a silent way of claiming it. You close your eyes, reflecting on the profound disparity between your opulent surroundings and your own meagre life. You are literally living inside a mountain of wealth. You've handled the king's jewels, Section 6, served meals prepared with exotic spices, Section 2, and walked on floors covered with expensive rushes, Section 8. Yet your own living conditions are those of a pauper. This stark contrast between visible splendour and hidden squalor brings up a central debate for historians. Historians still argue whether the high turnover rate and poor morale among the lower ranks of palace servants were a consequence of the low wages and brutal hours, or whether the psychological burden of being constantly exposed to incredible, untouchable wealth, while living in conditions of profound poverty and lack of dignity, was the greater long-term driver of servant dissatisfaction and ultimate departure. Was it the body or the spirit that finally broke them? You fall into a brief, deep sleep, punctuated by the sharp anxiety of your internal clock you dare not oversleep. You dream of the city outside, your brief taste of freedom in Section 14, but the dream quickly turns into a stressful vision of carrying the enormous sloshing chamber pot, Section 1, down an endless staircase, with the face of the chief steward, Section 5, glaring at you from the top. The palace begins to stir outside your door. You hear the faint, distant sounds of movement, the inevitable early morning foot traffic of the staff hierarchy you learned about in Section 4. It is the beginning of the next cycle. You rub the sleep from your eyes, your brief moments of selfhood already fading. You retrieve your uniform, smoothing the wrinkles as best you can in the dim light. You prepare to step back out into the demanding world of the palace, ready to take up whatever menial, dangerous, or politically charged task awaits you. But this small, cold room has done its work. It has provided the minimal, necessary physical and psychological refuge. You are ready to leave, but for many of your colleagues the idea of leaving the palace permanently is unthinkable. For others, it is the ultimate desperate goal. Your next and final shift will explore the few, precarious ways a servant's life at court could reach its conclusion, the great uncertain leap from service into the unknown, a world of potential freedom or total ruin. You emerge from your cramped, shared room, Section 17, feeling the weight of the palace system settle back onto your shoulders. The routine of service is restarting. The first bells are ringing, signalling the pre-dawn preparations for the king's waking ceremony, the beginning of the cycle, as you remember from Section 1. But this is your final shift, the last movement in your current role. It forces you to confront the ultimate question. How does a life of relentless palace service actually end? The possible endings are few, and most of them are fraught with risk. For the servant there is no easy resignation, no simple 2 weeks' notice. Your departure is either a carefully negotiated, much-delayed retirement, a lucky planned promotion out of the household entirely, or a sudden, devastating ruin. You report for duty, running messages through the corridors you now know intimately, the hidden passages, Section 9, the service staircases and the public halls. As you move, you reflect on the high-ranking servants who actually do retire, the yeomen, the master cooks, or the high-ranking grooms. They are the fortunate few who manage to secure a pension. This security, though rare, is the mainstream historical fact that formed the ultimate carrot for palace service. After decades of continuous loyal work, the king or queen might grant a servant a modest annual payment for life, often paid out of the privy purse, or perhaps a small honorary salaried position for the rest of their days, like a minor wardenship. This pension was rarely enough to make them rich, but it was sufficient to guarantee a small secure room and a steady plate of food until death. To achieve this, however, required flawless service, avoiding the chief steward's wrath, Section 5, never being implicated in theft, Section 15, and surviving the constant threat of disease, Section 8. It was a lottery, and the odds were stacked against you. You know of one gentleman usher who recently retired with a small property. He did this by leveraging his long service and, more importantly, through the accepted practice of receiving gifts from courtiers. Nobles and ministers often tipped the senior staff who had the power to grant them access to the king or a favourable seating arrangement at a banquet, Section 11. These gratuities, compounded over 20 years, formed a much larger nest egg than the royal salary alone. The second path is the lucky promotion. Some servants, often those who were highly educated or politically astute, were noticed by a high-ranking noble and taken into their private service, or even granted a minor official post outside the palace. You, having run clandestine messages and witnessed political intrigue, Section 9, might have caught the eye of a powerful minister who needs a sharp, discreet agent. This is a precarious step. You're trading the known tyranny of the royal court for the unknown, often capricious tyranny of a single powerful patron. It's a risk of elevated opportunity, but also of elevated danger. You witness a silent, sombre processional, a small coffin being carried out a side door, attended by a handful of staff. This is the third and most common ending: death in service. The palace's brutal hours, poor food, and the constant threat of contagions mean many servants simply die on the job, their end unremarked upon by the nobles. Their possessions, that small wooden chest, Section 17, and their uniform, are inventoried by the yeomen of the stores, and their places quickly filled. You overhear two older chambermaids whispering about a former colleague. This provides a truly grim, quirky, or fringe tidbit of palace aftermath. Occasionally, when a high-ranking noble died or was executed, their personal staff, especially those who knew too many secrets, were suddenly and completely cut loose, or even imprisoned to ensure their silence. The security of the servant was intrinsically linked to the stability and favour of their master. A servant's knowledge, which was their greatest asset during their service, could instantly become a deadly liability upon the fall of the person they served. But the most feared ending is ruin. This is the immediate non-pensionable dismissal resulting from a major infraction. Serious theft, treasonable speech, a dangerous mistake, like dropping the king's garment during the levee, Section 6, or impregnating a servant girl, Section 10. The chief steward's final authority on this is terrifying: instant expulsion from the palace grounds, the confiscation of all wages, and a black mark against your name that ensures no respectable household will ever hire you again. You're literally thrown out the gate with nothing, facing starvation and utter destitution in the dangerous city, a place you only knew during your brief protected day off, Section 14. This threat is the lash that drives your every move. You're suddenly called aside by a gentleman of the bedchamber whom you served during the daily dressing ritual. He holds a small velvet pouch. You have performed your duties efficiently, he says, with a rare, almost shocking hint of kindness. My cousin, a master of the wardrobe in the capital, requires a new, discreet page. I have recommended you. He requires an answer before the day is out. This is your moment. It is a terrifying, unplanned opportunity. It's not a pension, but it's a lateral move, a step into a new household where your past palace mistakes are forgotten. It means a new, slightly higher rank, slightly better pay, and a chance to escape the deep toxicity of your current post. You stand there, the offer hanging in the cold morning air. You realise this is the question historians grapple with constantly. Historians still argue whether the relative social mobility achieved by a small percentage of lucky servants, like the opportunity now presented to you, was evidence of a surprisingly meritocratic element within the aristocratic hierarchy, or whether these promotions were merely another way for the elite to extend their power, pulling trusted servants into key roles to ensure their own networks were loyal and well-informed. Was this a reward for merit, or a strategic recruitment of a trustworthy agent? You look down the long corridor, where the first signs of the day's labour are emerging: a kitchen hand carrying a heavy basket of wood, a chambermaid rushing to the king's room. You remember the crocodile dung sunscreen, the greasy laundry, the constant fear, the cold nights, and the crushing exhaustion. You know what you have survived. You look back at the gentleman who is waiting patiently. You bow deeply, the gesture of deference now a habit that feels as natural as breathing. "Sir," you say, your voice cracking slightly with emotion you dare not show, "I accept. Thank you for your kindness." The gentleman smiles, a small knowing political expression. He hands you a sealed letter of introduction, your ticket out. You are instantly discharged from your current duties. You have until nightfall to collect your meagre belongings and leave the palace grounds. You turn and walk toward the staff annex not to work but to gather your chest. The stone floors no longer feel like a treadmill of endless labour, but a pathway to a terrifying, uncertain but necessary freedom. You have escaped the gilded cage. The sun is just beginning its ascent now, sending long, dusty shafts of light across the quiet city streets outside your window. The immense palace, the one we just explored together, is now fading back into the deep history from which we summoned it. The page, or the scullion, or the yeoman, the person you have been for these past hours, has found their ending, walking away with nothing but a frayed uniform, a small chest, and the profound, silent knowledge of the king's inner world. That world of whispers, silk, filth and terror is shutting down for the night. Its sounds, the clamour of the kitchens, the rattle of the guards' boots, the gentle snuff of the candles, all receding into the quiet hum of your own room. Breathe deeply. Let go of the heat of the kitchens and the cold of the long nights. The palace demands its silence now. It's time to rest.